to our last of the day's inaugural events for our Center for Entrepreneurship, Social Good, and Transformational Leadership. Tonight is very symbolic because as we open the Dr. Mark and Shelley Wilson Center for Entrepreneurship, Social Good, and Transformational Leadership, it speaks to the history of this institution, it speaks to where we're going, and it speaks to the opportunity that we have now committed ourselves to for our students, faculty, and staff members. So in addition to this being a day where we spent time in a think tank, so those of you that came by and were able to watch and participate, thank you for doing that. From that moment, we were able to have lots of conversation and have come up with some really good ideas and ways to move forward, particularly around the concept of social good. So for us, this idea of this center really is about the ways in which we ensure that particularly the youth have a way going forward. And so as I think about why it's important to have this center and why it was important to launch the center and want to kind of read a couple of words from the president, President Felton, if you don't mind. In your booklet that you have, there's an article written by him that shares a little bit about why this is such an important moment. And what I want to read or say to you is the center is an opportunity for us to experiment, build, research, and shape our world. It's our intent to use these three platforms, entrepreneurship, social good, and transformational leadership, to inspire radical change for our students and the communities from which they come and will return. So that, to me, in essence, captures this idea and captures this work and captures our way forward. So with that, I won't take up much time because I know that they have a lot of things that they'd like to share. But Dr. Felton will host us tonight, so let's give him a round of applause. And also a round of applause for this extraordinary vision. I think that one of the things that when we have a visionary leader, it's important to encourage and to communicate why something like this is important. But in particular, as we think about the students that we serve, think about the communities that they are coming from and going back to, this is such an opportunity. And many of our students are coming to us talking about the idea that they want to be entrepreneurs or want to participate in a particular major that an additional entrepreneurial spirit would help them further along. And so this is more than just something as simple as we have this center and let's kind of go forward. It's an opportunity for all of us to participate in really particular ways to ensure that not only our students but our communities are well served. So thank you very much, President Felton. I also want to introduce Dr. Joseph Jones from Arkansas Baptist College. And he will also be serving as in conversation night. So we have a real treat because not only do we have Dr. Felton, Dr. Jones was the executive director for the Institute for Social Justice at Philander Smith College. And if you're not aware, you might, at PWIs, you might find cultural centers and social justice centers, but at HBCUs are a little bit harder to find. And so being able to have the opportunity to have both of you and have you talk about social justice and social good is a real treat tonight. So before we get started, I just also wanted to say thank you to our panelists that were able to join us today. Dr. Rodney Coyne, if you want to wave. Dr. Tanisha Taylor, and our very own Professor Cheryl Durgans. So thank you. Without further ado, I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Tasha. Let me first acknowledge our faculty members who are here today. No, it's been a long day for you, but I find it particularly nice that you came out this evening to be a part of this scholarship. So thank you for coming out. To our students and others who are here with us tonight, I want to welcome you. When we started this journey, it has not been, will never be, and is not about how many people come out. It's about the people who are doing the work. And so we don't judge success or failure on numbers because we know that one is enough to spark, and a spark is where fire happens. So I want to thank you all for being here. I also want to thank my colleague, Dr. Jones, for being here, the president of Arkansas Baptist College, for braving the weather and getting up in the air to come from Little Rock to be with us this evening. So we're going to have conversation, and I'm particularly excited too because of the work that he's done and the work that we desire to do here at Wilberforce. So we're going to jump right in, but before we do that, I'll yield the floor to Dr. Jones for any opening remarks that he might have.
Well, first of all, let me say good evening, everyone. I just want to commend you for your visionary leadership for this center. As the sister said earlier, there are not a lot of black colleges that have these centers that do this work. It's so important in this historical moment that this work is done at black colleges, to be thinking, to be planning, to actually be in engagement and activism around things of social good, entrepreneurship, and specifically this thing about leadership. And I hope that we really have an opportunity to really, really unpack that, because I think that is something that we've got to get right, you know, and in all of our institutions. But I look forward to the conversation. I have a very vast background. For people who do not know, let me just kind of run down my bio real quick. I went to Philander Smith College, undergraduate in political science, went to Clark Atlanta University, got my PhD in political science, was a faculty member in teaching political science for about 10 years. I've taught at Clark Atlanta, I've taught at Johnson C. Smith, where I met Dr. Pinkert, and Philander Smith College, University of Arkansas, Pine Bluff. So my experiences at HBCUs is rich and it's broad. But my transition into administration came when I went back to Philander Smith College, and our good friend and colleague, Dr. Walter Kimbrough, contacted me. And just a very interesting story about he and I. We were in beef for some years, believe it or not. I was an alumni rep. He came to Philander with this vision of social justice, which I thought was really, really watered down. So I was sending him nasty letters all the time saying, you know what, stop, playing lip service to this. Let's do some real things. And then about the summer of 2009, at an alumni convention, an older black lady kind of grabbed us by the ears and pulled us in the room and said, hey, you two are both intelligent black men. You guys got to sit down in this room and work together. And that's when we began to, that was actually the first time we actually ever met each other, because we had just been playing email tag and kind of going back and forth. But he talked about his vision for the college, and I talked about my critique of his vision. And so he did what any good leader would do. He added me to the committee to be able to shape the vision for Philander. And I served on the committee. And one of the recommendations that came out of the committee was to create an institute for social justice. And so I went back to Charlotte. I was, like I said, at Johnson C. Smith. I was really doing well. Just had a postdoc at Harvard. I was at the Boys Institute. And he called me up and said, hey, I want you to come lead this institute. I said no, and hung the phone up. He called me back and said, hey, I want you to come lead this institute. I said no, hung up. He kept calling back. And he said, okay, at the very least, come and interview, right? I mean, it's a free trip to Little Rock. You're coming back to your alma mater. Just indulge me with that. And so I did. I took the bait. And when I got there and I talked with him and I met with the students and I saw the excitement around the opportunity, I got hooked. And the rest, they say, is history. And that is when I began to start to do this work, really interesting work, because the timing itself was around the exact same time when America started to shift and really, really think about social justice, specifically as it relates to police violence and other things. And so during the time I led the Institute, we were right in the middle of it. We took students to Ferguson, we took students to DC. We even rallied around some injustice that happened in Little Rock. But I'll stop. But I just want to give you a sense of who I am and my commitment and my lens in doing this work. And so translating those experiences, to the presidency has been a very interesting transition. So, but I yield to your questions, Mr. President.
Thank you. Framing, the center and this work. If you're asleep, you don't know what's going on in America right now today. And if you're connected to Wilberforce, then you should, one, know what's going on in America, and two, see the nexus, right? Our students, we're in the Rust Belt. Our students, a large population of them are graduating with degrees in business. and they all, I said this earlier today, they all say they want to open up their own businesses. And so, you know, we felt like this center was something that was appropriate, but also mutually beneficial for both the institution and the student, and also for their surrounding communities, you know, where they're going back home. And so the ideal is very simple. We want to produce entrepreneurs or individuals with the entrepreneurial mindset who understand what it means to be socially conscious and to also be leaders. That's it in a nutshell. And so there are three components: the Center for Entrepreneurship, the Center for Social Good, and the Center for Transformational Leadership, separate and independent. Altogether, they make up an institute. And so we wanted to really parse it out so that we could talk specifically about one, raise money specifically about one, and do the same for the other three. And we thought to kick off the center, we would start with social good, given the climate in America today. So we have a few questions that we have, and we, at any time, you can feel free to ask questions and have some participation. But he and I are just going to have a discussion, and feel free to interrupt as you like. I have a few questions, and I'm going to jump all over the place because I'm a non-traditionalist, and I just like to do stuff any kind of way. Why is this a relevant discussion in the 21st century? Let's start there.
Wow.
Let's unpack that.
Wow, wow. So, because the work is not done, quite simply. It's relevant because, you know, struggle is a continuum. When we start talking about social good, it's not a destination. It is, you know, it's the journey. As human beings, if you look throughout history, you'll know that human beings have always struggled with dealing with one another, you know, whether it's civilization, building institutions, you know, dealing with very, very complex problems. But in this historic moment, I think it's so important that college students and faculty and staff really think about, you know, what can the academy do in order to respond to what is going on. If you think about every generation that grows up in their own time, there are certain watershed moments that kind of shape their consciousness, right? And if you talk to certain people in certain generations, whether it's the baby boomers or those who've come out of the Great Depressions, you know, they're always saving money because they remember how scarce things were. People who come out of the Civil Rights Movement or the Black Power movement are, you know, highly skeptical of you know, government activity. And so as we think about our students as our children and them growing up in this moment, and what they've seen and what they've witnessed just in the past 10 or 15 years, it's been a lot, right? Whether it's natural disasters and the government's response to national disasters. We think about Katrina. We think about what just happened in Puerto Rico, right? And how we have been responding in certain situations where people of color are there, but our government is not responding in ways that is consistent with other spaces. It's relevant because these issues are continuing on and on and on, and we as human beings, we as a democracy, as a country, have not perfected a response, or we haven't come up with a solution to solve or to prevent these problems from keep happening. And so a conversation needs to go on, and it's very important that the conversation starts with us and that we frame the conversation as opposed to it coming from other places, because most of the time the problem keeps perpetuating. And so that to me is the most cogent and concise way I can answer that, is that this is so relevant because the problems are still here.
Yeah, so what's interesting for me, you know, in studying Black history and particularly the Civil Rights Movement, and one of the things that also drove us was to this very point right now, was what is the role of the student? What can a student at an HBCU do? If we think about the history, presidents were afraid
Yes.
to be a part of the civil rights movement. Presidents at HBCUs, they were afraid because they were afraid of their students' welfare, their health, et cetera. I have the position now, and I don't know if this is one that our colleagues share, but we can ill afford to be afraid now. And so because our students should be on the front line, should be a part of the conversation in the judicial process and the legislative process, we have to equip them with the tools that they need. How then does we shape their prism to allow them to be effective agitators? You know, how do we move them to that space? Because nothing has changed from today. Everything is, you know, what we're dealing with now is a 2.0 version of Jim Crowism.
Yes.
Right? And so we want our students, and college is that place where activism should be born and they should be safe. But I think it prudent and necessary for us to give them a rubric to move in this space, both on the front lines and behind the closed doors.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, there are a couple of things in response to that question, and I want you all to really appreciate the weight and the value of your president's words right now. There are not many presidents that are going to stand up and say they want their students out and engaged in this kind of activism. I mean, I think both of us are anomalous in our peer group, where we feel like this is a value. This is very antithetical to most people in our positions, but I think that probably our own generational shaping and what we've seen has kind of caused us to be in this space. But for one, I mean, we've got to model it, right? We got to say those words out loud. We've got to be able to back up our faculty, because, you know, if we think about student activism in whether it was in the 60s, the 50s, or the 30s, or the 20s, whatever, it was black faculty that were the ones that were introducing students to different terms and ideologies and experiences. So for us as presidents, we got to be able to allow our faculty to be able to provide these experiences for our students. And then the second thing is, we got to lend our voices to this cause, right? You know, I'll never forget 3 months into my job at the presidency, and we know that our current president began to start to pass legislation around undocumented workers and not coming into the country. And there were several calls that were going out from national associations asking presidents to lend their name and their institution name to a letter that basically says, we do not support this, you know. And it was an easy call for me to be able to add my name and Arkansas Baptist College name to that, to say, no, we stand with the people who are saying that this policy is not right.
You know, I think there were 28 of us that did it.
Yes. And so that's out of 105, right? HBCUs. And so it's like, but you know, doing those things is important, because for our students to see that we stand with people, you know, in a moment. And some of our campuses may have some of those students, some of them didn't. My campus didn't have any students that were affected by it, but it was still important to be an ally in that space, to be able to say that this was wrong. Right. And so just modeling the behavior, I think, is very, very important, because it's one thing to play lip service and say, go do these things. But when they see us doing it, you know, in a very proud way, then I think it inspires them to say, okay, they're not just talking.
Yeah, so my mom would always say, if you want to be on the cutting edge, you need to be prepared to be cut. So, you know, what are the implications for presidents and institutions, you know, taking what is a bold, by some perceived as a bold stance, as doing, for some of us say, what is right. Right. What do you think the implications are? And have you experienced any as your time as the executive director for that center?
Well, as president, no. As executive director, yes. When we started the institute, we knew that we were doing something vastly different. And the people that work with me, we really were students of history, students of struggle in such a way that in many ways we had a 5-year plan. Because we figured if we were doing what we would say we were going to do, that we had about 5 years before there was going to be some people who were going to try to shut us down. And that shutdown could be in any kind of multiple ways, because history tells us that when you engage in that kind of struggle, when you are allied, but the good thing about our work, when we started it, like I said, our historical moment is that there was a general consciousness that was going across the nation. So we weren't alone.
Because
right?
of Ferguson.
Because of Ferguson, right. So our voice was just, it was blended in with a choir of other voices all across, and it was very organic. And so it kind of gave us cover, to kind of do that work in a way that we weren't just, one institute or one college that was basically, making these critiques. And so, whether it was God's plan or just, the moment that it was in, that gave us kind of shelter. But even with that, there are some backlashes, right? Even administratively, there was sometimes I would talk to my president and he was like, no, you can't do those things. And I would say, well, we would be inauthentic if we didn't. And one specific issue, and this is what it really, really got complicated, and I knew that there was a lot of heat that was coming down. Specifically the issue dealing with LGBTQ students at our college. Spelman College did a survey where they sent a survey out to all 105 HBCUs and asked them to respond with regards to their policies and practices and so on and so forth. And Beverly Guy Sheftar, who's a professor at Spelman, I'll never forget, I was in a meeting, and I was like maybe 6 months into the job. When she saw me and she saw that I was over the institute, she cussed me out. She was like, you guys talking all this social justice stuff, you guys didn't fill out the survey and send it back to us. And no HBCU did at that time. None of them did. But I made a promise, and I said that I was going to do it. So I went back and I found out where it was at because it was sent to some obscure office, and we sent it back. But then that was something that was very, very important for us because we had a population of students like that at our campus, and making sure that they
we
would
all
say,
do.
Yes, we all do. We do. And being able to be able to say that, look, we affirm you in this space, but we were United Methodist, institution. Our bishop was literally on our campus. And so we would have these conversations, or we would align with them. The bishop who was on the board, would go down to the president and say, hey, what's up with this? But for a couple of the presidents, because I went through 3 presidents while I was the executive director, a couple of them kind of stood tall with me and supported that. But it does come with risk, because when you get into those weeds and you become an ally, not an ally, a comrade in those struggles, then, but that's just part of the work.
Yeah, so social good comes with a price tag. And I think everyone needs to really understand that. You pay a price, I think in most cases, for sticking up for oftentimes what is considered to be the least of us, or those who are voiceless, right? And so when you have leadership that supports both at be at the board level, the presidential level, and then you have these missionaries, spirited individuals on the campus that carry out that vision. They have to know that they're supported.
Right.
And I thought one of the things that you said was interesting about the professor who kind of called you on the carpet about, doing this work. If you're going to do this work, it requires that you do all of the work. You don't cherry pick.
Right.
You certainly can't do it all, but when it comes to a question about social good, it is invariably right to take the position that may not be most popular, right? And so I'll never forget, and I don't know where it came from, but it was a moment when I was looking at my students here, and I said in chapel, we are Wilberforce University. We are gay, we are straight, we are lesbian, we are transgender, we are Catholic, we are all these things. And before that day ended, I had about 5 or 6 phone calls right? And I don't know where they came from, who they came from, but I had members of the church, I had alums calling me, asking me, "Hey, we heard you said something in chapel today," and so my response was, "Who are we?"
Right.
So I took the position of reframing the question and getting them to answer the question just to see how they would respond to it. And so that the power dynamic, there was a shift in the power from just asking that question. But my point is that when we talk about the price of social good, social justice, race relations, whatever it is, there's a price that you have to pay, and I think you have to know that going in.
Yes.
You have to know that you are going to take some unpopular stances, and that comes with the territory.
Absolutely.
If you don't mind, I'm going to pause for a second if there are any questions that we may have. Yes, sir. Yes. Sam? Yes, sir. I'll be here. President Phelps, Dr. Jones.
Yes.
Dr. Bradley, everyone else, good evening. First of all, I just want to say, take a quote of a little poem, and it basically deals with Marianne Williamson, but it states, our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. And when I say that powerful beyond measure, it basically deals with some of the dialogue that you gentlemen were talking about in regards to leadership, social good. There are too many dynamics of social good for us not to be as powerful as we know we can be. But the bottom line is there's no consistency. There is no consistency. Leadership, sometimes leadership fails. That's a good thing. Because then again, when we get in that position or a specific position, we know what to do or not what to do. And myself, being a veteran, I'm a Marine, but an Army soldier. Sometimes it takes initiative, regardless of who's going to speak negative about you. I can honestly say, I came back in 06 from over the water when I was recalled. God brought me back. God brought me back. And ever since then, you all have to excuse me because it's kind of touchy when you work with comrades and people and you find out their lives have been taken. In this country here, we take life for granted. Education is a joke in this country. That's when I got my orders to come back here, I did not want to come back. I didn't. But it's like now, I know what I must do. I must set the example. I have to. Because these students are our future, regardless of where they come from. Regardless of where they come from. And what they see us do, what they hear, what we do, they mirror that. And if they don't see consistency, what's the use? And regarding HBCUs, I'm pretty sure we all have an excellent idea of some knowledge of what's going on with a lot of HBCUs because of lack of leadership. And what you gentlemen spoke on, I really appreciate it because, that's consistent. Before my feet hit the floor, I'll be dead in the morning. Thank you, God. Because I made the wake up to this. And the bottom line is, I know who runs my world. Man will let you down every time. But when we have God in it, it makes a big difference. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before we proceed? I That's all.
Can I respond to this gentleman just real quick? He talked about, leadership, and this is something that we got to be honest about. We talk about the lack of leadership in our communities, but we know that there was a systematic effort to eradicate a lot of our leadership at a particular time period here in America. And for all intents and purposes, they were successful. People were killed, people are in jail, people are exiled for doing the work we're talking about. I think that, our generation is, we've read about it, I've talked to people, but we never actually experienced it in the sense that we saw, people killed for doing things, But my mom and dad and grandmother and grandfather, they lived through that. So there's a kind of naivety for us because, we know it and we're trying to do it, but we can't. Yeah, but we can't. But that's important, and it's important for us to find the courage to do that. But back to your point, Mr. President, there's a price to that. There's a price when you step out. Not only government price, but there's a community price too. There are some people who are just comfortable in a space and do not want change to happen.
Yeah, I always quote Tony Pinkard when he talks about there are people who like the waters murky and dark so they can slime and slither and just operate in mediocrity.
Yes.
But when the water is clear, it dictates that everybody must swim and swim in the right direction.
That's right.
And so that too, that analogy is about social justice as well. It's about coming to a place like Wilberforce and defying the odds, right? So we find ourselves in a place where it is okay and almost a societal norm to talk about the shape that the students are in, or the shape that the institution is in, or the shape that the administration is in, and that gives, whether it be staff or faculty members, license to be mediocre. Right. And what happens is two things. Stagnation is prevalent because you as an individual will not grow or prosper because you're being mediocrity or mediocre.
Right.
And the institution hurts. And when I say the institution, that's the students, that's your other colleagues, and the staff members as well. Familiarity breeds contempt.
Absolutely.
And when you have more that are operating with contentious behavior more than not, then you have a recipe for absolute disaster. And I think when you look at our institutions, you find that, not just Wilberforce. And that is to social good. That is to social justice. Like, social justice is so ambiguous. Social good is so ambiguous. Like, it is just everywhere. Everything that we do every day lends itself to the definition, I believe, of social good.
I think we had a question right there.
Yes, sir.
Just a comment. I'm not a Marine, I'm not a Green Beret, just an old railroad guy, but on leadership, I just kind of wonder if we are really able to recognize leadership in our face. I think I deal with students every day, and I've got one student that I'm really working with right now, and he's a member of one of the nation's larger name games. And I asked him one day about the numbers of individuals that, are a part of that group. And it's in the thousands, And whenever I hear the name of that game or another one, all I get is this negative connotation because all the news is bad news about that. But when you step back from it and just think about the leadership that it takes, to and get all this mass of individuals moving in a particular direction, if we could just harness that, you know, and turn them toward Wall Street, you know, or someone else even to do entrepreneurship, particularly through entrepreneurship, you know, that would be great. You know, so I think I have become very mindful of that. And in fact, I've infused a lot of this entrepreneurship into my classes right now, and I'll share that with you at some time in the future. But we're surrounded by leadership, and I just see so many of these kids.
Yeah.
In school.
So good doctors ought to want to treat sick patients, right? So if you're this brilliant professor, why go to Harvard, where you literally don't have to do anything? Why not be at a place like Wilberforce that challenges you to look below, look deep, to pour into those vessels that will become extensions of yourself? Why not do that? You know, and I think what you're modeling is leadership on a level that I think benefits both you and the student, because what we know about millennials, what we know about next gens, they won't admit to this, but they want leadership. They want accountability. They want to be affirmed. But the smart people in the room have to be cognizant of those desires that they have. And when you have people who are cognizant of those desires, that's a recipe for winning. But when you have those who see a kid with his britches hanging down, or the young lady with her groceries hanging out, and you want to admonish as opposed to affirm, then you have a recipe for disaster. So that's leadership, and that's a social cognitive gift, I think, that works really well at places where you find millennials, not just at Wilberforce, but at places where you find millennials. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, why does an HBCU need to participate in this social good space? Why is it necessary for HBCUs to partake in this these types of endeavors?
What I used to tell my students all the time is that the black college is the black community, quite simply. There's a symbiotic relationship between black colleges and black communities, and to get a barometer of how black life is doing in this country is just to look at our black colleges. So the conversation has to be here if we're going to improve our communities. You know, black colleges are one of the very few institutions that exist where there is such a diversity of black folk in one space, from Detroit, from Chicago, from Atlanta, from LA, and so on and so forth. You get them all in one space.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if we can figure out, we can work together and get this together here,
Yeah.
then we should be able to take it out there. So that's the most important part of why these conversations need to happen, because where else are they going to happen? I mean, we have black churches that work up the space, but the academy is a space where knowledge is interrogated, it's explored, it's debated, and then you come up with the solutions, and we send our students out there to do that. So it's not even a question of why. It's why aren't we doing more of it? Because that is it's innate to us, because our communities are so embedded into the just into the college, just by makeup and even by geography.
Yeah.
You know. So I mean, so that's how I've always looked at it.
So in a lot of ways, the village concept needs to be dusted off and put back into action, right? And the village was this notion that it took more than one family or one group to raise a child,
Right.
and when we think about what our children are going through now, what they're subjected to now, like, I mean, even the technology, the stuff that, I'm 46, and I didn't have to deal with half of the stuff that kids are dealing with now. And when we talk about these, I think you coined the frame armchair or Twitter revolutionists, we talk about them and the misinformation that they put out, the knee-jerk type of activism that we have. We talk about that type of activists. How do we get our students to understand the power of patience in this tricky space and time?
Well, let me answer that question by answering a broader question, and it kind of goes back to the role of the important role of Black institutions. When we look at history and we look at any society or any country, we know that if change is going to happen, changes happen through institutions. It's just very simple. And through institutions, specifically through socialization. Socialization is people engaging one another, A lot of what goes on online is indoctrination, it's misinformation, it's just information being thrown around. But this is why this space is so important, because here we have a captive audience of students who live here, for a certain amount of time. They go to classes, engage with our faculty. There are student affairs that have functions and stuff like this for us to be able to socialize them to understand why this work is so important. And you can't get that by watching a video. You can't get that by posting a feed. You can't get that by tweeting. To be able to sit down and talk to two college presidents in this space about and pick their brain, you can't get that, in the World Wide Web. And so, but the question is, what spaces allow for these kind of conversations? And this is why it comes back to Black. This is why it's so important.
Why it's so important.
Why it's so important right here. And so it goes back to my earlier responses. We've got to get this right. Now, how do we teach patience? I don't know. I got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I'm in that struggle right now. So, but you kind of grow into. But it's practicing, right? It's showing it, right? You're not going to teach an impatient child patience by being impatient with them.
Yeah,
you're just not. You have to model it, constantly and consistently, and never set expectations that you're not willing to meet yourself.
Yeah.
So
the other piece for me is what I've found to be pretty fascinating watching the Twitter revolutionists and the Facebook activists is when there's conflict, they're loudest. When conflict is no longer, then I believe that's the time when you should be more loud, most loud. How do we teach the modern day activists the two-pronged approach that MLK and Bayard Rustin and Stokely Carmichael and all of those guys utilize, Ella Baker, yeah, utilize Fannie Lou, exactly. How do we teach them to re-indoctrinate or reincorporate the two-pronged approach that is a pen and the sword?
And then this is where we as faculty and staff can do a deep dive into the lives of those individuals and really paint a picture, right? Sometimes we romanticize some of their accomplishments, but there was a discipline, there was an order during that time period. I mean, if you think about the impact Ella Baker had on Martin Luther King and the conversations that they were having, pushing him, you know, to think differently about certain things, it was because of socialization, because they were in conversations. They met up at churches. They strategized. It wasn't always in a reactionary thing. They were actually proactive. In fact, they invited the conflict in many cases because they were in conversation. It's not rocket science. This is a time-tested, going probably back, you know, centuries. People talking to one another and engaging, planning in a very systematic way, you know, in an intentional way. Let me say, a very intentional way. And so what we see on Twitter, what we see on Facebook is this reactionary kind of things. Things happen, people just say what's on their mind, right? Or say what's in their heart. Well, I think in this space, we can really interrogate and mine issues in such a way so that people can not only just respond, but respond in such a way in asking questions about, okay, what are we going to do, right? Like, how do we organize around to solve this problem, as opposed to saying, oh man, this is just bad. In order to do that, we got to pour that into our students, and I'm thinking and I'm believing that the center will be able to do that, and that's exactly what we did at Philander Smith College with the Social Justice Institute. I mean, we weren't indoctrinating anybody. We were just teaching them about the various ways and various things of social justice, and the students started to begin to raise questions on their own.
So they were modeling behavior.
They were modeling behavior
that they saw.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and then they took action on their own, under the guidance of elders.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
And bring up a topic that is probably politically incorrect and taboo. But while we're on the topic of social good, I'm thinking there's no secret that HBCUs have some serious financial difficulties. And a lot of times, there are those politically incorrect conversations, I think, that need to be had in talking about the financial issues that seem to have a ripple effect that affects the leadership, that trickles down to the faculty and the staff and the students. And I think sometimes because those issues are not being talked about because they're so intertwined with politics and just taboo, you know, we just don't talk about those things. I'm just wondering, is there a point, when we think about change, is there a point to which that conversation, I think it should be had? I guess I'm trying to be clear about what I'm asking. I guess I want to say we need to have a conversation.
Right.
And we need to talk about, you know, what are we going to do about that big thing, that big monster, that big issue that is affecting so much, to where everything else is seemingly surface. It's seemingly like we're touching on issues that are very important, but we're not, you know, I almost want to say we're driving the Benz, but we're living in a house that's standing on 2 bricks. And I just, you know, I mean, like I said, I'm being brave and even touching on this, but I wanted to bring that concern and that question to you. So what do you think about that?
I feel like you're one of my faculty members.
She's one of mine. So.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, but I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. I think that, you know, it's no secret that a lot of our colleges face financial distress, but I don't think it negates us from still taking a stand and having these important conversations. And just like most black institutions we got to figure out how to do it all, you know. And because we can't risk not doing it in such a way. Now, I think the question that you're asking is, you know, how do these conversations become more public, and, you know, how do we, you know, actually deal with this? You know, I don't have an answer for you. At my college, I try to be as transparent as I can be about it. But there's just some things that, you know, just can't be, you know, divulged. But I think it's an important and salient point that you make. But my response is simply this: we got to do both. You know, it's important to do that, but not be naive. You know, I mean, I don't think anybody in this room is naive about, you know, challenges or issues that any institution has to face. But and more importantly, our organizations, our institutions have always been in financial distress, and they still have these conversations.
They're distressed assets.
Yes, I mean,
that's what they are.
Yeah, but regardless, and so you look at the struggles. You think about the people who built, Wilberforce. You think about the people that built. I mean, they were enslaved with 1850 what?
1856.
I mean, this was during
Before.
enslavement. I mean,
That's
so
right.
you talk about, but they had enough gumption to say, okay, you know what, we can't wait till slavery ends, we're going to do this now, and we're going to work through this. And so I think that's the approach that many of our institutions has taken. We got to continue to keep taking if we're serious about justice.
I think it's a really good question. And, it's one of those things where I honestly wish I could transfer some of the stress that I have.
Amen.
But I also know that my mama didn't tell me how poor we were, because my responsibility was to go to school and get an education. And she managed that. You also don't want to be walking around not knowing when the sky is going to fall either. But the question is really, how much information do you give? What we know about places that are like Wilberforce, I won't say Wilberforce, is that there's so much bad information, and even when people get good information, they turn it into bad information, and it then becomes another problem that you have to manage. So the question always is, with boards and presidents and the administration, is how much information is enough information, right? And so you are absolutely spot on, and I don't think anything that you said was inappropriate. They're good questions, but I think it comes down to a managerial style. It comes down to the population that the manager is managing, and his or her belief about how they will manage the information that is given to them as well. It's some tricky shit, to be honest with you. It's just tricky. As Tasha Bradley cringes as I say that, I don't know any other way to describe.
No other adjective.
Yeah, or adjective to describe it. But there has to be a level, as my colleague said, there has to be a level of transparency, and the question really falls on how much information is enough. Yes, sir.
As a class of HBCU leaders, across the 105. Okay. HBCU leaders, what percentage have ascended to that level with corporate experience, as opposed to ascending via academia?
They
The
die.
value of corporate experience valuable.
Yeah, they die when they come into the space. They die. They come with a rubric or a model that has worked for a perfect scenario. And we were just talking about it, me and Doc, we need the duct tape approach. We want best practices as well, but you also need to understand the duct tape approach. One of the reasons in the research is that assimilation is a problem. They come in, those who have not attended HBCUs, not worked at HBCUs, when they come in, they don't understand that the culture is different, and that different doesn't mean deficient, it's just different. And it's very rare. In the last 10 years, there have been, I think, 4 presidents who came in from a corporate mindset with no experience at an HBCU, and none of them are at HBCUs right now today. So I don't think the question is the lack of business model centric leadership. I think it has more to do with visionary leadership and leaders that allow more of a horizontal approach to rest, rule, and abide at an institution as opposed to a vertical.
And this draw to this kind of corporate, see what the corporate model does is in business, there's a discipline, right? There is accountability, there's a plan, there's an execution strategy, there's an evaluation. And so when I hear these terms and I hear these things going around, what our institution needs is those practices, right? Like, we need to be able to return a phone call. We need to be able to turn our reports in, you know, on time. We need
Be accountable.
We need to be able to have those practices. But let's be clear, we're not a business, right? We are in the business of higher education, which means educate, which is vastly different from corporations. And so for somebody who doesn't understand that and really do that, it's always going to be a mismatch. But it does not mean we can't use the practices, right? Of good practices, of making sure that we do those things. And there are a lot of our institutions that, you know, they just don't follow through. They don't answer the phone. They don't, you know, they show up to work late and leave early for lunch and then come back and leave. I mean, those kind of things, but in the corporate world would not be, you know, wouldn't be tolerated.
Yeah,
because
I mean,
you have a time clock and you got to come out. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I mean, accountability.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at the corporate structure, we at HBCUs are done at accountability, and that's the first model.
Yes.
Like, the stuff that happens at our institutions wouldn't even happen at
Right.
Subway.
No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. It wouldn't.
It wouldn't even be allowed at Subway.
No.
Right? And so when we talk about, you know, moving to the 21st century and being extraordinary, I mean, we can't even get past the first step of
Coming to
the
work on
corporate
time.
model, of coming to work on time, and then angry about being admonished because you didn't come to work on time. Or try this one on for size, not understanding that you are in a service-oriented business and you come to work with an attitude. Right. Like, I mean, I don't know where and how that's supposed to work.
Right.
But a lot of those leaders, and I'm not going to suggest that they're fired. I think most of them leave out of frustration because this is a different place and space to work at. And if you don't have thick skin, if you don't, you know, if you can't manage parents calling you and giving you the business, you can't manage nasty letters written about you. I'm not even talking about the finances. I'm talking about the stuff that happens to people, that happen to you by people. If you can't manage that stuff, that doesn't happen in the corporate world. So to try and apply, you know, that type of leader at one of these places, I mean, it's just a recipe for a disaster.
Absolutely.
Yes, ma'am.
You, Mr. President, said something about them leaving out of frustration. I mean, I would think of the staff we have here, my professors, and I know what they do here wouldn't be done outside if it was some other school, because I know where I come from is different. My question is, how do we stop this student, because they, I know, can drain the teacher. You know, they come with this so much energy, and the students be, you know, acting weird and funny, and they just like take the teaching out of the teacher. So how do we have the teacher know, okay, you were in charge, I am in charge of this class. How do we have them know that you were a leader? How do we transfer this to the students and not allow the students drop whatever they have in there?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, right? And I think a lot of it deals with leadership, the individual professor. I've been around some students who were running out of the caf here to get to their professor's class because we know she's going to lock the door at 12. Or, I've walked down halls and heard professors say, get out of my class. It is about the individual, I think. We cannot act as if we don't have students who might not necessarily be prepared for college or even should be here, right? So I think it would be disingenuous for us to not acknowledge that. And to also acknowledge that faculty members, by and large, are here to teach. They want to do that. And that they are handicapped because of some of the behaviors of some of our students. But that's where the rub is. Because we know traditionally that our institutions were designed, and the mission, we still operate in that framework, to give every student an opportunity to receive an education, right? And so that's where the rub is. You want to give them an opportunity because you know what's going on outside the radius of Wilberforce or Central State or Howard or Hampton or Spelman. You know what's going to happen to those students. So it becomes a question of nurturing or really leaving to their own vices. And we know what happens when we leave students and those who are not prepared to their own devices. And so you probably err in keeping them around, giving them opportunities, but that is, really this social good piece again, right? Our institutions were founded because we had to be founded. And we still exist because we must exist. And we know if our nation is going to be the best that it once was, Wilberforce has to do its part, Central State has to do its part, Arkansas Baptist has to do its part, and that means we got to go out and get kids kicking and screaming, take them where they are, and take them where they need to be so that they can be active participants in a global society. And it's tricky. It's tricky.
Let me respond and then that you answer your question. So I've been having this conversation with my faculty since I got to Arkansas Baptist College, because one of the first things I did before I became president is that I went on campus and I met with everybody. I told all the senior leaders, I don't want to talk to y'all. I started off with the janitors and cooks, and I went and just heard a narrative about what they thought about. Then I went and spoke with the senior leaders to try to see if it was consistent. Faculty, one of their critiques were, these students, like, they're just, they're this, and they don't do this, and so on and so forth. And it was draining because they would just, and every time I hear somebody, blame somebody else for their problems, that's a red flag, right? Where's your critique, right? I mean, where is your involvement in it, specifically if you're a faculty member? There's this concept that's been becoming more popular nowadays in dealing with, minority, underserved, students or whatever, and it's called asset framing as opposed to deficit framing. And we went through this exercise. I went to a retreat where this brother got up there and he told everybody to to find somebody and face them. And when you're looking at them, to name 5 things that is wrong with them and tell them that to their face. Now, imagine being face to face with somebody. You're looking them right in the eye. What do you say, right? You don't even know this person, right? I mean, what is it that you say that's wrong with them? With their heads too big? I mean, their lips are. What do you? But you think about, when we think about our students, we automatically just jump to some conclusions. They're ghetto, they're this, they're that. And we think about their condition or whatever, we define them by that, as opposed to see them as just who they simply are, students, right? And so I've been having this conversation with my faculty about this, and there was a book, and I'm forgetting the author. It's called There's Nothing Wrong with Black Children. And in the book, he makes the argument around when educating black children, there's a simple formula. Like you set the standards high, you be consistent, and you model the behavior, and they'll always rise to the occasion. It's not hard. It's not hard. But when you come to class late as a professor, right? When you have your students turn their assignments in at a date and you don't accept any late papers, but you take 2 months to get it back to them, right? It's inconsistent. So, kind of going back to you, for me, for my faculty is, no, they're not the problem. You need to figure out a way to engage and to deal with them. There's a scene in The Karate Kid with Jalen Smith, where he's having a conversation with Jackie Chan, and Jalen goes in and he says, all those students and blah, 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 talking about the students that are, beefing with him or whatever, and Jackie Chan checks him. He said, there's no such thing as, bad students. It's bad teachers, right? In China, that is the way of life, because the students come here as a vessel, and the students model the behavior of the people that are teaching them. And that's the power, the sacred power of faculty members and professors. And sometimes if we don't understand that power in relationship to our students, then it comes off in that way. And that's why those students respect those faculty that come to class on time, because they set the standard high, and those students respect them, and they're consistent with it, I would assume.
Yeah.
And so, but if you're not consistent, the respect is not going to be there.
Yeah,
so.
and it goes back to, the assertion that students, they don't know it.
Right.
But they want leadership.
Yes,
they
absolutely.
Want
Absolutely.
parameters.
Absolutely.
They want guidance. My
Absolutely.
final question, and we can have, questions, but, the talented 10th. We talk about, and everybody's familiar with the talented 10th, I'm going to assume. But if you're not, it's this notion that the 10% of the black folk who went out and got education were tasked. It was an inherent obligation for them to go back and educate the masses. Does that concept work in this spirit or the space of social good? Can that concept work? Is it alive already? How do you infuse that responsibility into this notion of leading? Because there was, when you look at every movement, there was a percentage of folk that moved, the masses.
So I will use Du Bois's own words. Du Bois wrote that piece in Souls of Black Folk in 1903. 40 years later, he came back and critiqued himself and said that, no, I was wrong. It's the guiding 100th that we need to be thinking about with regards to the race, because he just assumed during that time period, and you got to think about the time period in which he lived, that black folks got education and it would come back, and he didn't in his feeble mind, he didn't think that people would be selfish, right? That people didn't want to be around black people. He just
too much was at stake.
Yeah, too much. Yeah, he just thought. So so I don't think that concept has never been never been true in a sense, but specifically if you want to try to put a percentage on it. But is there a responsibility for those of us who do have, education, who are conscious? Can all of us who have been in the academy, come out of the academy, do something within our lives to affect social good? Absolutely. And we must. And we have to consistently do that. It is definitely our responsibility, but and it doesn't have to be as black and white as we think about it, right? It doesn't mean you got to be on the front line, in Ferguson, being an activist or whatever. It can be in your own respective spaces. You're talking about entrepreneurship. You're talking about corporations. When you're at that table, right? I'll pick on Dove for a moment. When you're at that table, and they show you a clip of an advertisement where they show a black woman who is there, and then the Dove goes over there and she turns into a white woman. Do you stand up in that space and say that is racist? That cannot air, right? That in those spaces you can make change if you are proud enough to lend your voice and be courageous in those moments. And many of us are in those moments all the time. But do we have the courage to know what we know is right? To stand up in those spaces, and whether it's there, whether it's in a school board meeting, whether it's anywhere alive, being able to make sure that the least of these, all of us, even if it's our children or not, stand up and do the right thing. And that just takes, like I said, courage to be able to do that. So there are frontline activists and there are boardroom activists. You know, there are art activists. There are all kind of folks. And this is why we used to teach our students at the Social Justice Institute. And the reason why we said social justice, because we see social justice as this umbrella, and there are various different types of injustices, whatever. So when we would conversate with all the students that came to us, no matter what their major was, we could talk to them about an injustice. Whether they were biology, whether they were English or whatever, we can talk to them. It's like, this is how you can impact change in whatever you do, whatever you're. And so that would be my charge tonight to the students, is just when you're in those situations, stand up and speak up and be courageous.
Thank you, brother. Any questions, comments before we have some closing thoughts? None? Yes, ma'am.
Just one question. So what would be a good example of how to start, like, tomorrow in the classroom? Give me an example of what it would mean to implement social change within the area that you're teaching in.
What is your discipline?
Mine?
Yes.
Counseling.
Counseling. Oh, that's easy. You're doing that every day. I mean, that's as a part of that, and that's a very, very good question, because it's easy to make the charge, and it's like, how do you do that practically, right? Mm-hmm. That takes conversation. That takes reading, right? That takes engaging other scholars and being in conversations around what this means. But it also means engaging students and understanding what their issues are, right? And how they understand the world, right? What are their problems? Because sometimes if you get up and have this pulpit kind of, perspective in dealing with students and say, well, these are the problems. Yeah. No, you tell me what the problems are. What are you seeing in the world that you think are complicated? And in having those conversations, introducing new things in it, that's how you kind of raise consciousness. And you can do that in any one of your disciplines. Yeah. And that's how you start, and you continue the dialogue constantly. And what happened, and what has happened, and I've been gone from the Institute almost 3 years. Actually, I went back for the first time in 3 years last weekend. It was homecoming, and I braved it, and I went up to the office, and I saw the office manager, who I never met before, but she knew who I was when I walked through the door. Oh my God, Dr. Jones is the founder of the social, and she started talking about everything that we started back in 2010 was still being replicated. She's like, students are still coming to the office, wanting to have these conversations. Because what happened was all those, first-year students and sophomores and juniors, they went back and they talked to their peers. Mm-hmm. And they went back and they talked to their peers. And they knew that was the space to kind of go and have conversations. And she just felt so inept because, she didn't feel like they had the capacity to really deal with it. But that was probably one of the best compliments I think I've ever received, as a professional, that something that we started back then is still living. It's still living on, despite that it shut down for almost an entire year. And when it came back, people are still part of that. And that's socialization. That is how change happens. It doesn't happen in one day. It doesn't happen in a month. But if you commit to it, if you commit to the discipline, and you have a plan and a strategy, you keep working, you'll see the outcomes. So.
Yeah, just to add to that, I taught at Murray State for 4 years, and then at Livingstone off and on for 9. And I taught Murray in the Government Law and International Affairs Department. So I taught business law, criminal law, public administration, all this stuff. And I started my class, every one of my classes, 5 minutes, what's going on in the world today. Right. And that what's going on in the world could be what's going on in your world. Right. And my classes, I don't know why, but I always had a waiting list to get in my classes. And part of being the, adjunct of the year, part of the rationale that the students would talk about was their ability to have a conversation. Right. And even though it lasted for 5 minutes, because we only had 50 minutes and it was never enough time, but I thought it important enough to have conversations about anything that they wanted to. And it ranged from Beyonce to what was going on in North Korea or, the IMF. It didn't matter. But that also made me a person that had to read an enormous amount of information because I wanted to be conversant. Every time a student said something about something, I wanted to be able to have a conversation with them. And in a lot of ways, it allowed me, a black man in rural Western Kentucky, to talk to them about things that they probably had never had a conversation with an adult about, much less a black male adult about. And so I think a lot of social good came from those conversations. So, to echo his sentiments, it's just conversation. And I think we have to strip, these titles and these things down to what they really are, and it's basic conversation. And that's where everything starts. That's where everything ends. And if we're able to step out of our comfort zones and humanize ourselves, I think you find students, in a different space, a different place too. So, final thoughts.
I would just say ditto. Socialization, engagement, being intentional. I just want to compliment every one of you all and you, Mr. President, for this effort. This is so significant. I really wish I could really, tell you all how important this work is being done here at Wilberforce. This is huge, and this is gonna make national waves, international waves, and I'm proud to be a part of the conversation, and being here in this moment, in this space, in this historical time period, to say that I was here when this all began. So I'm just very, very happy to be here, and so congratulations on your.
Thank you, brother. And I want to close by thanking Dr. Tasha Bradley. She is serving as the interim executive director for the center, and had to do so because it was forced upon her. She's no stranger to this work, but presidents need teammates that allow them to say crazy stuff, and they pull it out of the air and make it come to fruition. And Tasha, you have done that. Today is a glowing example of your scholarship, your research, and your ability to coalesce around some ambiguous stuff and bring it to life. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart as a colleague for the work that you've done and the work that you will continue to do here at Wilberforce. I also want to thank our provost. He's probably the meanest, coolest person that you know, who helped also guide this. There are so many people that brought this to light, but we had these conversations sitting around a bar in Atlanta, Georgia, back in August of 2016. And I remember that like it was yesterday when we talked about the work that we wanted to do when we got here. And we are here. And I want to thank you. And I also want to thank the best faculty on this side of the Mississippi. They really come to work, they show up, they give it their best. And our students, who I think they know how I feel about them. They're the bomb diggity, and really appreciate them, and the staff members too. So I just want to thank you all for the work that you do here at Wilberforce. And Dr. Jones, you have done the work, my brother. And if we are half as successful as the center was at Philander, then we've done our part. So thank you for giving us a blueprint, brother. Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you, man. That was fun, man. Yeah, man.